All right, sweet. Well, if you could, just turn with me to Genesis chapter 40. My name is Brandon. I want to thank Victor for taking all the main points for the whole story of Joseph. That made it easier for all of us to kind of piggyback off of you, so I appreciate it. So we're going to be in the chapter where Joseph is in prison, and so just to kind of recap in case you weren't paying attention to what's happened so far in the story of Joseph, we've got this guy named Joseph, who's a part of the family and heritage of Abraham. Abraham was spoken to by God that he would be a father of many nations, that God would make him a great man. And Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, and one of those 12 sons is Joseph. And so when the story picks up for Joseph, it seems like Genesis kind of turns away from the story of the patriarchs as it kind of follows this guy Joseph to Egypt. And so Joseph, we see, is having a pretty rough time. Not only was he sold into slavery by his own family, his brothers. Imagine how traumatizing that must have been. But not only that, but once in Egypt, and even though God was moving and working in his life, and God was causing him to be promoted and kind of have a pretty successful time in Egypt, it says that he, as Victor spoke about, was falsely accused of rape by Potiphar's wife. And so Joseph's life literally has gone from bad to worse. And we see that this is not because anything Joseph has done right. This wasn't because Joseph was a punk, or Joseph was a sinner, or Joseph was this guy that was doing all kinds of crazy activities and God was punishing him, or he was one that was in Egypt just causing havoc and trouble and hitting on Potiphar's wife and he got caught. The Bible tells us that this wasn't because of anything Joseph had done, but because of life's tough circumstances. And so I'm just thinking, like, imagine if that was you. Imagine if you were Joseph, and not only were you away from your family, completely alone, no contact with them, no Facebook or Twitter or Pinterest to check up on your family. You were completely cut off from them, but now you are in jail. And so as somebody that feared God, Joseph knew God, understood that God was with him. He probably thought of all times that God had abandoned him, or that God hated him, or that maybe God was somehow punishing him, or that God had left him when he had gotten to Egypt. And I don't know if you've ever been in a time like this where you felt like God has maybe abandoned you. And it's interesting, and Victor kind of touched on it, that even as a Christian, even as somebody that follows God, even as someone that professes faith in Jesus Christ, we still go through hard times. And some people, maybe that's a financial situation, or maybe your parents get divorced, or maybe your family member or yourself has gone through physical illness, or maybe you have been an abuse victim, or maybe you have suffered with depression, or maybe loneliness or anxiety, or maybe someone that's close to you has passed away, or maybe whatever. We go through tough times in our life, even as Christians, and sometimes it's easy to think, or easy to kind of think, man, like maybe God has left me or abandoned me. And for me, the biggest time that happened was when I was in high school. I dealt with a lot of depression in high school, even as a Christian, even as a Christ follower. And it was interesting because it wasn't because of necessarily anything that I did. It was outside events that came to me and caused me to have a really tough time. And so as we look at the story of Joseph found in chapter 40, it would be easy for him to think of this situation as where God has left him or abandoned him. And so the big idea for this chapter is, even as Joseph is experiencing such pain, it's all a part of God's plan. And because sometimes we think that if we're going through pain as a Christian, that means that we're outside of God's plan. But we're going to see in this chapter that sometimes our pain is a part of God's plan. And so picking up the story in chapter 40, verse 1, it says, sometime after this, or after Joseph had been thrown in prison, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, and the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. So convenient, so convenient. In the prison where Joseph was confined, the captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with him, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with his own interpretation. Verse 6, when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the story records that sometime after Joseph was put in prison and he's been put in charge of the entire prison, a random day happens and two of Pharaoh's closest aides are put in prison with Joseph. And so we see that this was not just a random turn of events, and this was way more than a coincidence. And so even though it seemed like this was maybe just happenstance, we see that God was beginning to orchestrate some events, even in the midst of such a tough circumstance. And so it says that the cupbearer of the king of Egypt, as well as the baker, are put under Joseph's care, and Joseph is personally attending to them. And so Joseph, as a faithful young man that he was caring for them, he was attending to their needs daily, and the text records that one morning, Joseph wakes up and maybe he's giving them breakfast or water or attending to their needs, and he sees that they're both really upset, and Joseph comes to them and he asks them, he says, "Guys, what's wrong? Like, what's going on? It seems like you guys are extremely upset." And they both said, "We both had these crazy dreams last night, and we have no one to interpret them." In Egyptian culture, and we touched on this in class a little bit, that they had these schools of dreams, or these kind of classes that they would take for dream interpretations. And so in Egyptian minds, only people that could interpret dreams were those sorcerers that would go to these schools. And so basically what the prisoners were saying was, the reason that we're so upset is that we had these crazy dreams and that we don't have any of our trained professionals to interpret them. But Joseph says to them, he says, "It's interesting because I serve the living God, and it's only God that can interpret dreams. Please tell them to me." And so we see that this was more than a coincidence, right? We see that even though Joseph was in a tough situation, even though Joseph was in prison, in charge of prison, we see that God was beginning to orchestrate events for his ultimate deliverance. And so sometimes when we have hard times, right, it's hard to see that God is working in our lives, right? It's easy on the front end when we're looking at somebody else's hard times, or maybe on the back end when we get out of it. But it's hard, right, when we're in the middle of a hard time, when we're in the middle of a tough circumstance, it's hard to see that God is really working in our lives, or that he has a plan, especially when we're in a lot of pain. This last fall, just kind of quickly recounting, my brother was in the hospital for a pretty extended period of time. He's 11, super cute, curly hair, glasses. His name's Bryce, and he has just a ton of allergies. So we thought he was just sick a lot because of allergies, but it turns out he had a problem with his colon, and it was ulcerative colitis is what it ended up being. But there was just a turn of events where he just kept bleeding out of his stool, just consistently bleeding. And so he went to the hospital, like end of October, and he was in the hospital for a pretty extended period of time. And I remember just kind of thinking, and it was hard to see, like in the time, I thought, man, God, like what is happening? What are you doing? This is my brother, this is my family. Why are we going through this? And it was hard to see in the middle of it as we're praying for him, like, God, do you really have a plan in this? Like, God, is this an accident? God, what are you doing? Are you punishing our family? Is it something that my brother has done? But we know now that God had a plan in everything, and he's good now, he's still alive now. But it's hard in the middle of a hard time or in a hard circumstance to see that God has a plan, especially in the midst of our pain. And so for Joseph, just imagine he's just being faithful to his prison duties. He's just being faithful to what God has put him in. And we see that God was beginning to orchestrate these events where the king's cupbearer and the baker come, and he's there to interpret these dreams. This was more than a coincidence. Picking up the story in verse 9, it says, "So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, 'In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. And as soon as it budded, its blossom shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand.' Then Joseph said to him," this is the interpretation, "the 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." Verse 16, "Then when the chief baker saw that this interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, 'I also had a dream, and there were 3 cake baskets on my head, And in the upmost basket there were all sorts of baked foods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said to him, well, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and in 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. That's awkward. So what happens is Joseph tells the dreams, and he interprets both of them. And the first one to the cupbearer, he says, okay, that's a good dream. In 3 days, you're going to have your position lifted up to you. He says, okay, this is fantastic. Like, you're going to be restored. And so the baker says, oh, wow, this guy had a pretty favorable interpretation. So he asks Joseph, okay, what's my interpretation? And he says, okay, well, in 3 days, you're going to be hanged. Now, the text doesn't really record what happens after that, but I'm sure that was kind of an awkward moment. Like, thank you? Like, are you kidding? Is this a joke? But Joseph says, well, this is what God is saying to me. And so it doesn't really say much about what happens after that, especially in the days in between. But what we do see, we get a little glimpse into what Joseph is thinking. Because Joseph sees this as a potential way out. And as he tells the cupbearer, he says, okay, you're going to be restored. He says, okay, this is going to be great for you. And it says in verse 15 or verse 14 and 15, he says, okay, when you're restored, remember me. Remember me when you go back up to Pharaoh. Tell Pharaoh about me. Tell Pharaoh that I was falsely imprisoned, that I'm not even supposed to be here, and maybe he could get a way out. And Joseph most likely thinks that this is God's way of delivering him. And so if Joseph hadn't clued into the fact that God was working, or that God had a plan before this, maybe this is the first time that Joseph was thinking, okay, this is the way it's going to happen. This is the way that I'm going to get out. Joseph, having been moved to Egypt when he was 17, now it's years later, he's now thinking, okay, this is the way that I'm going to get delivered. This is the way that God is going to deliver me. And so imagine the excitement and the anticipation of Joseph. He's thinking, okay, I've waited for so long. I've been faithful in jail. I haven't cursed God. I haven't turned my back on my faith. I've been faithful to God. Now is the time where I'm going to get out. Imagine the excitement for Joseph as he's waiting for the 3 days to come to pass, when hopefully he was going to be let out of jail. And maybe he was going to be honored to say, yeah, I was the guy that interpreted the cupbearer's dream rightly and the baker's dream correctly as well. I'm going to get out. But the text records that it doesn't go according to Joseph's plan. Looking at verse 20, it says that on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among the servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so just as Joseph had predicted, in 3 days it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he decided to throw a party, and we don't really know why, but all of a sudden he says, you know what, I miss my cupbearer. Let's bring that guy back up. And maybe as he was bringing the cupbearer back up, he thought, man, that baker guy, I hate that guy. That guy sucks. I'm going to kill that guy. It's my birthday. I can do whatever I want. And it says that he kills the baker. It doesn't really tell us why it happens. But the key thing that it does tell us is that the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. And so what do you think Joseph was thinking? As he's waiting, maybe he could hear above him like the crowd like screaming, and it's a big party, and he's thinking, man, like, I'm going to be restored. And then he sees the cupbearer leave, and he sees the baker leave, and Joseph stayed in prison. He was extremely disappointed. If this was God's plan, if God was really working in his life, if God was really had his hand on his life, then why would God allow Joseph to stay in prison? And so it didn't work out as he thought it would work out. And I don't know how many of you guys watched the Seahawks game last night, but for the Green Bay Packers, it didn't work out how they thought it was going to work out. They had a for sure victory in their hands. Russell Wilson throws a Hail Mary. Green Bay Packer intercepts it. Oh wait, Golden Tate takes it from him. Touchdown, Seahawks. Game over. Okay, it didn't really work out how the Packers thought it was going to work out, and they were extremely disappointed. They were upset because they thought they had to win in the bag. And so for Joseph, he thought for sure, like, this was the way that God was going to deliver. God had been working in my life. God has been doing all these things to orchestrate these events. The chief cupbearer is restored. The baker is hanged, just how God had predicted. But Joseph stays in prison. And so just imagine just the excitement and the disappointment, kind of having his hopes crushed. And so Joseph, no doubt, was in a ton of pain and a ton of confusion. And so what do we do when God's plan leaves us in so much pain? If God is in charge, if God was working in the life of Joseph, if God was really sovereign, if God had brought in Joseph to Egypt, if God had helped him in Potiphar's house, if God had orchestrated all these events, why would God continue to leave him in so much pain? And so for us, and we could kind of make this about us now, we could think, okay, if I have gone through so much, if God is really in charge, if God is really working in my life, why is it that He would allow me to go through so much pain? Why is it that He would let my brother get sick? Why is it that He would let that person abuse me? Why is it that He would allow my parents to get divorced? Why is it that He would allow me to go through financial circumstances? Why is it that, fill in the blank. And so just going off Genesis 40, it doesn't tell us the reason why for Joseph. And so we thankfully have the end of the story, right? We know that God uses it to save him, save his family, create the nation of Israel, and ultimately the whole world would be blessed with the nation of Israel, which really comes to fruition as they're in the land of Egypt. But for Joseph, as he's sitting in the prison, the only thing that he could lean on was the promise that God was going to be with him. The only thing that he could lean on was just a simple faith to know that, okay, I know God is alive, I know I'm his child, I know that he loves me, and I know that he's going to be with me. And although there's pain, it doesn't mean that I'm apart from God's plan, but yet God has designed this pain as a part of his plan for his ultimate authority. And it says in Romans 8:28, and sometimes this seems like a throwaway verse, but it says that God works all things together for good for those who love him and those who are called according to his purpose. Hebrews 13:5 says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For he has said, Jesus has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Even in the midst of our pain, it doesn't mean that it's apart from God's plan, but sometimes it's a part of it. Amen.